I died saw what happens right before Jesus returns. Shocking NDE. The monitor's rhythmic beeping suddenly turned into a haunting flat line. We're losing him, I shouted, my hands pressing desperately against the small chest of 8-year-old Timothy Parker. 36 hours into my shift, and this was the moment that would define everything. Charged to 200, the defibrillator hummed to life. Clear, his tiny body jerked as electricity coursed through him. Nothing. Again. Charged to 250, I couldn't lose another child, not after promising his mother he would make it. Dr. Wilson? It's been 20 minutes, Sarah. My head nurse whispered. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. Time of. No, I cut her off. Continuing compressions. Come on, Timothy. Fight. The room fell silent, except for my counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then, like a miracle, a heartbeat. Weak at first, but growing stronger. 3 hours later, I stepped out of the hospital into the crisp Sunday morning air. My hands were still trembling. I had promised Mom I would go to church today, my first time since her funeral 6 months ago. I don't believe in God, but I believe in you, I had told her. Now, those words echoed in my mind as I drove down the quiet country road. The morning sun filtered through autumn leaves, and I found myself humming the hymn Mom used to sing. That's when I saw it, a mother deer frantically trying to reach her injured fawn in the middle of the road. I swerved instinctively, just as I had lunged countless times to save patience. The car spun out of control. Time slowed. In that split second before impact, I saw Timothy's face, my mother's smile, and strangely, a bright light growing stronger. Then darkness. But that darkness, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If this story has touched your heart, join our spiritual journey by subscribing. Each subscription strengthens our mission to share these divine messages. Together, we'll explore more incredible testimonies that could transform your perspective on life and faith. I never used to believe in miracles. As an emergency room doctor at St. Joseph's Hospital in Boston, I put my faith in science, in the steady beep of monitors, in the precision of surgical instruments, and in the countless hours of medical training that taught me how to save lives. My name is Emma Wilson, and for 15 years I've lived by one creed: death is simply a medical condition we haven't solved yet. That's what I told my mother during her final battle with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. We'll find another treatment, Mom. There's always another option. But Margaret Wilson, the strongest woman I knew, would just smile, that knowing smile of hers, clutching her worn Bible with one hand while stroking my hair with the other. Science is just God's way of showing us how He works, sweetheart, she'd say, even as the morphine dripped steadily into her veins. Her unwavering faith both frustrated and fascinated me. How could someone so intelligent, who'd raised me to question everything, believe so completely in something she couldn't see or prove? I remember the night everything changed. The oncology ward was quiet except for the soft whirring of machines. Mom's breathing had become labored, and I knew we were running out of time. I sat beside her bed, reviewing her charts for the 100th time, searching for something I might have missed. Emma, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Promise me something. I leaned closer, trying to hide the tears threatening to fall. Promise me you'll go to church. Just once. That's all I ask. I wanted to argue, to tell her about the double-blind studies disproving the power of prayer, about the scientific impossibility of resurrection. But looking into her eyes, seeing that mix of love and concern that had guided me through every crisis in my life, I couldn't refuse. I don't believe in God, Mom, but I believe in you. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. That's enough for now, my sweet girl. God will do the rest. Those were her last words to me. She slipped away at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, her Bible still clutched to her chest, that serene smile never leaving her face. The months that followed were a blur of 18-hour shifts, emergency surgeries, and countless cups of coffee. I threw myself into my work with renewed intensity, as if saving enough lives could somehow fill the void she left behind. My colleagues whispered their concerns about burnout, but I ignored them. In the ER, at least, everything made sense. Every problem had a solution, every crisis a protocol to follow. But late at night, when the adrenaline wore off and the hospital grew quiet, I'd find myself drawn to the small chapel in the basement. I never went in. My rational mind wouldn't allow it, but I'd stand in the doorway, remembering how Mom used to say that sometimes the heart needs what the mind can't understand. 6 months passed this way, until that fateful Sunday morning when young Timothy Parker was brought in, his small body broken from a fall. As I worked to save him, I could almost hear Mom's voice. Every heartbeat is a miracle, Emma. You just have to know where to look. I didn't know it then, but Mom's final request, that simple promise to attend church, would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything I believed about life, death, and the thin line between science and faith. Sometimes I wonder if she knew, somehow, what was coming. If her request wasn't just about faith, but about preparing me for what I would soon experience. But that's the thing about mothers, they always seem to know what we need, even when we don't understand it ourselves. And as I would soon learn, sometimes the biggest revelations come when we least expect them, wrapped in packages we never thought to open. That Sunday morning, as I pulled into the parking lot of St. Michael's Cathedral, every fiber of my scientific mind rebelled against what I was about to do. The Gothic spires reached toward the sky like accusing fingers, and the stained glass windows seemed to watch me with ancient, knowing eyes. I'd driven past this church hundreds of times on my way to the hospital, but this was different. Today, I was keeping a promise. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. On the passenger seat lay Mom's Bible, its pages worn and marked with countless sticky notes in her neat handwriting. I hadn't opened it since her death, but something compelled me to bring it today. This is ridiculous, I muttered to myself. I'm a doctor, not a believer. The morning service wouldn't start for another hour, but already people were arriving, families in their Sunday best, elderly couples helping each other up the steps, young parents wrestling with squirming toddlers. They all had one thing in common: a sense of purpose, of belonging. I envied their certainty. In the ER, I was Dr. Emma Wilson, the one people turned to in crisis. I made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. But here, in this parking lot, I was just a daughter trying to honor her mother's last wish, and I felt more lost than I ever had with a critical patient on my table. My pager buzzed, a reflex check to make sure it was still working. In the hospital, that sound meant action, purpose, clarity. Here, it was a lifeline to the world I understood. I'd arranged my schedule specifically for this morning, trading shifts and calling in favors. No emergencies could pull me away. No last-minute surgeries could save me from this moment. I thought about my patients, about Timothy Parker, still recovering in the pediatric ICU. What would they think if they knew their doctor was sitting in a church parking lot, contemplating the existence of a higher power? Science had always been my religion. The human body was my scripture, and the operating room my sanctuary. Yet Mom's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes the heart knows what the mind can't explain. A knock on my window startled me. An elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair smiled warmly. First time, she asked as I rolled down the window. Her name tag read Martha Greeter. Before I could respond, she continued, I can always tell. We all had our first time. Some of us just took longer to find our way here. Something in her voice reminded me of Mom. I'm not. I struggled to explain. You don't have to believe to be welcome, Martha said gently. Sometimes we come because we're searching, sometimes because we're hurting, and sometimes just because we made a promise to someone we love. My throat tightened. How did she know? I'm a doctor, I said, as if that explained everything. Martha's smile widened. Oh, honey, we've got 3 surgeons, 2 psychiatrists, and a quantum physicist in our congregation. God doesn't ask us to check our brains at the door. He gave us our minds to question, to explore, to understand. But He also gave us hearts to feel what our minds can't always comprehend. I found myself getting out of the car, Mom's Bible clutched to my chest like a shield. Each step toward the church doors felt like a battle between the rational doctor I'd always been and the daughter trying to keep a promise. I didn't know it then, but this internal struggle was about to become the least of my concerns. Life had a way of showing us that some questions can't be answered with medical textbooks or scientific journals. As I reached for the heavy wooden doors, I heard Mom's voice in my memory. Faith isn't the absence of doubt, Emma. It's the courage to keep searching for truth, even when the answers aren't clear. Little did I know, I was about to embark on a search for truth that would transcend both science and faith in ways I could never have imagined. The events that led me to that church began 36 hours earlier, during what started as a routine night shift in the ER. I'd just finished my 4th cup of coffee when the ambulance sirens pierced the quiet of the early morning hours. Multiple trauma incoming. 8-year-old male fall from 3rd-story window. My team snapped into action as the paramedics burst through the doors. On the stretcher lay Timothy Parker, his small body broken and bloody, BP dropping, severe head trauma, possible internal bleeding. The paramedic rattled off stats as we raced toward Trauma Room 1. Behind us, I could hear his mother's desperate screams, "Please save my baby. He's all I have." Timothy's vital signs were crashing. His pupils were unequal, a sign of increasing pressure in his brain. "Get CT on standby." "I need an OR prepped now," I commanded, my hands moving automatically through the initial assessment. That's when I saw at his chest rising unevenly, breath sounds diminishing on the right. Tension pneumothorax. "I need a chest tube." As I made the incision between his ribs, memories of my first chest tube insertion as a resident flooded back. Back then, my hands had trembled. Now they moved with the precision that only comes from years of practice. The rush of air confirmed my diagnosis. But we weren't out of the woods. Dr. Wilson Sarah called out. His mother's asking for updates. "She's a single parent," says Timothy climbed out looking for his cat. The detail hit me hard. I'd been raised by a single mother too. I knew that terror of being solely responsible for a child's life. The next 12 hours became a blur of surgeries. Timothy's injuries were extensive: ruptured spleen, fractured skull, broken ribs. We lost him twice on the operating table. Each time, as I felt his heart stop under my hands, I fought with everything I had. "Not this one," I muttered through gritted teeth. "Not on my watch." Between surgeries, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since Mom died. I talked to him. Not the clinical doctor to patient talk, but really talked. "Come on, Timothy. Your mom needs you. She's out there praying for you. I don't believe in prayer, but maybe you do. Maybe that's enough." The next 24 hours were critical. I refused to leave, catching moments of sleep in the on-call room between checking his vitals. His mother, Rachel, maintained her vigil in the waiting room, clutching a rosary and whispering prayers. I found myself envying her faith, her certainty that something bigger than medicine was at work. At hour 35, Timothy crashed again. This time was different. As I performed chest compressions, counting methodically 1, 2, 3, 4 times seemed to slow. The hospital sounds faded away, and I heard Mom's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. "Every life is a miracle, Emma. Sometimes we're just the vessels God works through." For the first time in my career, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about medical procedures and protocols. This was about a mother's love, a child's fight to live, and perhaps something more. As Timothy's heart finally started beating again, strong and steady, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been part of something I couldn't explain with my medical training. When I finally emerged from the ICU, exhausted but triumphant, Rachel Parker was waiting. She hugged me fiercely, her tears soaking my scrubs. "God sent you to save my son," she whispered. I started to give my usual response about skilled medical teams and advanced procedures, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I simply held her, remembering all the times Mom had held me the same way. As I watched Rachel return to her son's bedside, resuming her prayers, I made a decision. I would keep my promise to Mom. I would go to church that Sunday, if only to understand what gave people like Rachel Parker the strength to face their darkest hours with such unwavering hope. After leaving Timothy's bedside, I drove home in a daze, showered, and changed into the outfit I'd laid out for church. Mom's favorite blue dress and her pearl necklace. The early morning sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as I started my drive to St. Michael's Cathedral. The roads were quiet, typical for a Sunday morning, and my mind wandered between Timothy's recovery and the promise I was about to fulfill. I took the scenic road along River Road, the same path Mom and I used to drive every Sunday when I was young. Before medical school consumed my life, the familiar curves and ancient oaks brought back memories. Mom singing hymns off-key, our post-church brunches, her patient explanations of parables I couldn't understand. Everything happens for a reason, Emma, she'd say. I was about to learn just how true those words were. The radio played softly classical music, Mom's favorite. I caught myself humming along to Bach's Air on G-string, remembering how she'd close her eyes during this piece, saying it made her feel closer to heaven. That's when I first noticed the movement in my peripheral vision. A dew burst from the tree line, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, stumbling on unsteady legs, was her fawn, clearly injured. The mother deer kept looking back, desperate to protect her baby, even as cars approached. Time slowed as I processed the scene: the injured fawn in the road, the frantic mother, the curve ahead, the oncoming truck. In that split second, my doctor's instincts kicked in, the same instincts that had helped me save Timothy. I couldn't hit them. The mother's desperation to save her child mirrored everything I'd just witnessed in the hospital. I swerved hard, my hands acting before my brain could process the consequences. The car fishtailed. I felt the exact moment the tires lost their grip on the morning damp asphalt. Mom's pearl necklace swung wildly as the world began to spin. I remember thinking, with strange clarity, how the centrifugal force perfectly demonstrated the physics principles I'd learned in pre-med. The airbag deployed in a cloud of white powder as the car left the road. Through the windshield, I watched the massive oak tree approaching, the same tree where Mom used to park for our picnic lunches after church. How fitting, I thought, as metal crumpled and glass shattered. The last thing I saw was the mother deer guiding her limping fawn to safety. The impact wasn't what I expected. In the ER, I'd treated countless crash victims, and they all described the same thing: pain, fear, chaos. But in that moment, as my car wrapped around the oak tree, I felt an almost peaceful detachment. Maybe it was the doctor in me, clinically observing the situation, or maybe it was something else entirely. I heard the crunch of metal, felt the jolt of impact, but it was as if I was watching it happen to someone else. Through the spiderweb cracks in the windshield, I saw the morning sun creating a strange pattern of light and shadow. It reminded me of the stained glass windows at St. Michael's, the ones Mom loved so much. As consciousness began to fade, I thought about the irony. I'd spent my entire career fighting to keep people alive, and now, just yards from the church where I was supposed to keep my promise, I was the one slipping away. The last thing I remember was a sense of profound regret, not for swerving to save the deer, but for waiting so long to honor Mom's final wish. Then everything went dark. The darkness, I would soon learn, isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just the beginning of something far more extraordinary than anything our scientific minds can comprehend. As my body lay trapped in the wreckage, my consciousness was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything I believed about life, death, and the thin line between science and faith. The transition from darkness to light wasn't sudden. It was like watching the sunrise in time-lapse photography. I found myself floating above my crumpled car, watching as first responders arrived on the scene. Their sirens were silent, though I could see the flashing lights. Everything moved as if underwater, dreamlike and surreal. Female, mid-30s, severe trauma, I heard them call out, their voices oddly distant. I wanted to tell them my name, to explain I was Dr. Emma Wilson, that I knew exactly what they needed to do. but I was no longer connected to the body they were struggling to extract from the wreckage. Mom's pearl necklace glinted in the morning sun, now stained with blood. "No pulse," one paramedic shouted. I watched them start chest compressions, the same methodical rhythm I'd used on Timothy just hours before. How strange to see it from this perspective, to be the patient instead of the doctor. I wanted to tell them they were doing it wrong, that they needed to adjust their hand position slightly, but no words came out. That's when I noticed the light. Not the harsh fluorescent beams of the emergency vehicles or the morning sunlight filtering through the trees, but something entirely different. It emanated warmth that went beyond physical sensation, a warmth that seemed to touch my very essence. As a doctor, I'd heard countless near-death experience stories from my patients, but I'd always attributed them to oxygen deprivation or neural misfiring. Now, faced with my own experience, all my medical explanations felt hollow. The light grew stronger, and with it came a presence I can only describe as pure love. It wasn't a feeling I could quantify or measure, nothing that could be recorded on any hospital monitor, yet it was more real than anything I'd ever experienced. In that moment, all my years of scientific skepticism seemed to evaporate like morning dew. "Emma," a voice called, not through my ears, but directly into my consciousness. I turned, though how I moved without a body, I couldn't explain, and found myself face to face with Jesus. Not the stern figure from stained glass windows or the serene painting from my mother's Bible, but a presence so profound it defied description. His eyes held all the love, wisdom, and understanding I'd seen in my mother's eyes, multiplied infinitely. "But I don't believe in you," I heard myself say, the words forming without sound. "I'm a doctor. I believe in science." His smile was gentle, knowing. "Yet here you are," he gestured to the scene below, where paramedics continued their desperate efforts to revive my body. "Your science explains how the heart beats, Emma, but not what makes it want to beat. It shows you how life works, but not why." I thought of Timothy Parker, of how many times we lost and revived him. Is this what death feels like? "This isn't death, Emma. This is an invitation." He extended his hand, and in it, I saw scenes from my life playing like a hologram. Every patient I'd saved, every life I'd touched, every moment I'd dismissed miracle as coincidence. "You've been looking for proof in microscopes and medical textbooks, but some truths can only be seen with the heart." The irony wasn't lost on me, a doctor who'd spent her career fighting death, now standing in the presence of the one my mother had called the conqueror of death itself. I wanted to ask about cellular decay, about brain death timelines, about all the scientific impossibilities of resurrection. Instead, I found myself asking the question that had haunted me since my mother's death: why do good people suffer? His response wasn't what I expected. Instead of answering, he showed me a tapestry, an intricate weaving of countless threads. Up close, some threads seemed dark, twisted, broken. But stepping back, they formed part of a beautiful, complex pattern. "You see the individual threads," he said, "but I see the complete picture. What looks like suffering up close is often part of a greater healing." Below us, I heard a paramedic call out. "We're losing her." The medical part of my brain calculated the minutes without oxygen, estimated the chances of brain damage, ran through the protocols I'd used countless times. But here, in this place beyond time and space, those calculations seemed distant, almost irrelevant. "You have a choice to make, Emma," Jesus said, his voice filled with both love and solemnity. "But first, there's something you need to see." He held out his hand again, and I knew that taking it would change everything. All my years of medical training told me this couldn't be real, that near-death experiences were just the brain's way of coping with trauma. But as I looked into his eyes, I remembered my mother's words. Sometimes the heart knows what the mind can't explain. With what felt like the first truly free choice of my life, I reached out and took his hand. The moment our hands touched, the scene around us transformed. We were no longer above my accident, but standing in Timothy Parker's hospital room. The monitors beeped steadily, showing vital signs I could read as easily as my own name. Timothy lay there, small and fragile, with his mother Rachel asleep in the chair beside him, her rosary still clutched in her hands. "Watch," Jesus said softly. As if on cue, Timothy's monitors began to change. I recognized the patterns, the subtle shifts that often preceded a crash. My doctor's instincts screamed to act, to call a code, to save him, but in this form, I could only watch. "His brain swelling is increasing," Jesus explained, though he knew I'd already recognized the signs. "The surgery you performed bought him time, but there's damage you couldn't see." He paused, his eyes full of compassion. "This is where your choice begins." "What choice?" I asked, though something in my heart already knew the answer. "Right now, in the physical world, paramedics are fighting to revive you. If they succeed, you'll live. But if you return," he gestured to Timothy's monitors, which were steadily worsening, "his life will end. The human brain can only endure so much trauma." I felt my non-existent heart stop. "You're asking me to choose between my life and his." "I'm showing you how connected all lives are," he corrected gently. "Every choice, every action, creates ripples we can't always see. You saved Timothy yesterday, but that was only part of his journey. Now, you must decide if you're willing to give up your life so he can continue his." I watched Rachel stir in her sleep, her hand tightening on her rosary. "She's already lost her husband," I whispered. "She can't lose Timothy too." Then a horrible thought struck me. Is this some kind of test? Are you punishing me for not believing? Jesus' laugh was unexpected, warm, and full of genuine joy. "Emma, if I punished people for doubt, I'd have no one left to love. This isn't a test. It's a gift, the gift of truly understanding what your mother tried to teach you about sacrifice and love." The monitors beeped more urgently. In the physical world, I knew time was running out for both of us. I thought of all my years of medical training, of the Hippocratic oath I'd taken. "First, do no harm," I quoted. "Sometimes the greatest healing comes through sacrifice," Jesus replied. "But the choice must be yours, freely made." I looked at Timothy, remembering how hard I'd fought to save him during that marathon surgery. I thought of my own life, my career, my achievements, all the other patients I could help if I lived. But then I remembered my mother's words about love being the greatest force in the universe. "If I choose to save him," I asked, "what happens to me?" Jesus' eyes held mine. "You'll come with me. Your journey here will end, but your spirit will continue. And your sacrifice will create ripples of love and faith that will touch more lives than you can imagine." The choice crystallized in my mind with sudden clarity. As a doctor, I'd spent my life trying to save others. How could I choose differently now, when the stakes were so clear? "Will it hurt?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "The passing? No. But watching those you leave behind grieve, that brings its own kind of pain. Yet even in their grief, they'll find strength they never knew they had." I looked at Timothy one last time, then at Rachel. "She prayed for a miracle," I said quietly. "And you will be that miracle." Though not in the way she expected, Jesus held out his hand again. "Have you made your choice, Emma?" I thought of my mother, of her unwavering faith, of her belief that love was the greatest power in the universe. For the first time, I truly understood what she'd been trying to teach me all those years. Science could explain how we live, but love explains why we live. "Yes," I said firmly. "Save Timothy. Let me be the one to go." The moment the words left my lips, I felt a profound peace settle over me. Below us, Timothy's monitors stabilized, his vital signs strengthening. Rachel woke with a start, looking at her son with fresh hope in her eyes. "You've chosen well," Emma, Jesus said. And in his voice, I heard echoes of my mother's pride. "Now, let me show you what comes next." As we turned away from the hospital room, I realized that this wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning, one that would finally help me understand the truth my mother had lived by. The greatest acts of love often look like sacrifice to the world. but feel like freedom to the soul. The transition was unlike anything my medical training could have prepared me for. As we moved away from Timothy's hospital room, reality shifted in ways that defied physics. Colors I'd never seen before bloomed around us, and the very fabric of space seemed to pulse with life. My analytical mind struggled to process what my consciousness was experiencing. "What you're seeing," Jesus explained, as if reading my thoughts, "is the thin veil between your world and mine being pulled back." He gestured to what I can only describe as a living tapestry of light and energy. "Watch and understand what your sacrifice will create." The scene before us crystallized into a series of moments, like watching multiple TV screens simultaneously, yet somehow I could focus on each one perfectly. I saw Timothy growing up, not just surviving, but thriving. He was graduating medical school, wearing the same white coat I had worn, his mother Rachel beaming with pride in the audience. "He's following in my footsteps?" I asked, moved by the symmetry. "Your sacrifice becomes his inspiration," Jesus replied. "Your choice to give your life for his shapes his entire future." The vision shifted, showing Timothy in an emergency room, working with the same passionate intensity I had known. "He saves hundreds of lives, Emma. And each life he saves creates its own ripples of change." I watched as Timothy treated a young girl who would grow up to discover a breakthrough in cancer treatment. She, in turn, would save thousands, including a boy who would become a teacher and inspire a generation of scientists. The interconnected web of lives touched and changed was staggering. But it wasn't just about medical achievements. I saw Timothy sharing his story, my story, with patients who had lost hope. My life was saved by a doctor who gave everything he would tell them. She taught me that science and faith aren't enemies, they're two wings of the same bird. The scenes shifted again, and I saw something that made my scientific mind reel. The realm we had entered was both foreign and oddly familiar, like a place I'd known before birth and somehow forgotten. The physics here operated on different principles. Light had weight, thoughts had color, and love was a tangible force that bound everything together. "This is what Mom tried to tell me about, isn't it?" I asked, watching as pure energy transformed into landscapes of impossible beauty. "When she talked about heaven." Jesus smiled. "Your mother understood that heaven isn't just a place, it's a state of being where love becomes the fundamental force of reality." He led me through what appeared to be a garden, but every plant was alive with consciousness. Every flower sang with colors that responded to our presence. I saw souls engaged in work that brought them joy, creating art that captured emotions I had no words for, composing music that made the very air dance. "Everyone here contributes to the tapestry," Jesus explained. "Your medical knowledge doesn't disappear, it transforms. You'll help guide other healers, inspire them in moments of doubt, give them strength when they face impossible choices." Then I saw my mother. She was as I remembered her before the cancer, but more radiant with an inner light that made her even more beautiful. She was teaching a group of souls, sharing the wisdom she'd gained through her own journey of faith through suffering. When she saw me, her smile lit up the entire realm. "Not yet, Emma," Jesus said gently, holding me back as I moved toward her. "First, you need to understand the full scope of what's happening." The scene shifted again, and I saw my own funeral. It wasn't the somber affair I might have expected. Yes, there was grief, but there was also an undercurrent of something else: purpose. Rachel and Timothy were there, and I watched as Timothy placed a single white rose on my coffin. "I'll make her proud," he promised his mother. "I'll become the kind of doctor she was." Rachel hugged him, her faith and his determination creating a bond that would help them both heal. My colleagues from the hospital were present, and I saw how my choice would affect them too. Dr. James, the staunch atheist who had always scoffed at faith, sat quietly in the back, his worldview shaken by the circumstances of my death. Sarah, my head nurse, would start a support group for healthcare workers, helping them balance the scientific and spiritual aspects of their work. "Your death brings life in more ways than just saving Timothy," Jesus explained. "It bridges gaps between faith and science, between doubt and belief. It shows people that the greatest medical miracles sometimes come through sacrifice rather than science. The visions continued, showing me the ripple effects through years and generations. I saw lives saved, hearts changed, and faith rekindled. My story would become a testament to something greater than either science or religion alone could explain the transformative power of sacrificial love. Now, Jesus said, as the visions faded back into the overwhelming beauty of this realm, are you ready to understand what your mother always knew? That love is the force that moves mountains, changes hearts, and transcends death itself. Before I could answer, a shadow passed through the light around us. A presence was approaching something dark and ancient, and I felt Jesus' hand tighten on mine. But first, he said, his voice carrying a note of solemnity I hadn't heard before, you must face one more test. For where there is great love and sacrifice, the enemy always seeks to intervene. The darkness that approached was unlike any I'd encountered in the physical world. As a doctor, I'd seen death countless times, but this was different, a void that seemed to consume light itself. The beautiful realm around us didn't dim. Instead, the darkness existed as a tear in reality, a negation of everything good and true. From this void emerged a figure both beautiful and terrible. He appeared as I might have imagined a senior physician, distinguished, authoritative, wearing a white coat that seemed to mock my profession. His smile was perfect, practiced, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. Dr. Emma Wilson, he said, his voice smooth as morphine, the dedicated scientist, the rational mind, the one who never believed, until now. Jesus' presence beside me remained steady, but he didn't intervene. This, I realized, was part of the choice, not just the sacrifice for Timothy, but what that sacrifice would mean. You've always been a problem solver, Emma Satan continued, pacing in a way that reminded me of hospital rounds. So let's look at this logically. One life for another? That's hardly efficient. What about all the other patients you could save? All the breakthroughs you might achieve? He gestured, and suddenly I saw visions of my own future, one where I lived. I saw myself discovering a revolutionary treatment for pediatric brain trauma. Hundreds of children, just like Timothy, would be saved. I saw myself accepting the Nobel Prize in medicine, my research changing the face of emergency care forever. All these lives, he whispered, balanced against just one boy. The logical part of my mind, the doctor, the scientist, felt the pull of his argument. The numbers made sense. The greater good was clear. But something felt wrong about his calculations, like a diagnosis that matched the symptoms but missed the underlying cause. And let's talk about your mother, he said, his voice softening with false sympathy. He waved his hand, and I saw her last days in the hospital, the pain, the fear, the moments of doubt she never showed me. All that suffering. And for what? A God who didn't save her? But you could change that. Another vision appeared me, alive, developing a cure for pancreatic cancer. I saw my mother, healthy and proud, watching me save countless others from the fate she suffered. You're a doctor, Emma? You understand evidence, causation, reality? Why choose a beautiful lie over the chance to create real, measurable good in the world? My mind raced with possibilities. The tempter's logic was seductive, appealing to everything I'd believed as a scientist. One life against many, measurable impact versus spiritual symbolism, facts versus faith. But then I remembered Timothy's mother's face, her desperate prayers, her unwavering hope. I thought of my own mother, not in her moments of suffering, but in her moments of transcendent faith. The greatest scientific discoveries, she used to say, begin when we admit there are things we can't explain. Your offer is logical, I said finally, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. But it's based on a false premise. You're assuming we have to choose between science and faith, between measurable outcomes and miraculous ones. The tempter's smile faltered slightly. You're a scientist, Dr. Wilson. Surely you understand. I understand that the most fundamental law of physics, is that energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed, I interrupted. I understand that the observer effect in quantum mechanics suggests consciousness itself affects reality. I understand that the more we learn about the universe, the more mysteries we uncover. I felt Jesus' quiet approval as I continued. My mother didn't die for nothing. She showed me that faith isn't the opposite of science, it's the courage to admit that our knowledge has limits. And my sacrifice for Timothy isn't just about saving one life versus many. It's about showing that love is as real and powerful as any force we can measure in a lab. The tempter's facade cracked, his distinguished appearance flickering to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. You could do so much more alive, he hissed, all pretense of rationality gone. Why waste your potential on one meaningless gesture? Because some truths can only be proven through sacrifice, I replied, thinking of every parent who'd given everything for their child, every soldier who'd died for their comrades, every person who'd chosen love over logic. And some experiments require us to be not just the observer, but the catalyst for change. The darkness around him roiled, but I felt no fear. In that moment, I understood what my mother had tried to tell me, that faith wasn't about ignoring science, but about recognizing that love was the most powerful force in any universe. You've made your choice, then, he sneered. To throw away everything you've worked for. No, I said quietly. I'm choosing to prove that the greatest medical miracle isn't the one we perform in an operating room. It's the one that happens when we love enough to give everything. I turned to Jesus, whose pride in my response was palpable. I'm ready. Ready. The tempter's form dissolved into shadow, his promises of scientific glory fading like mist in morning sun. As he vanished, I felt a profound sense of peace, the kind that comes not from winning an argument, but from finally understanding a truth that transcends debate. You answered well, Jesus said, breaking his silence. Not by denying your science, but by understanding its limits and its harmony with faith. Looking at where the tempter had been, I smiled. Mom always said that the best doctors know that healing involves more than just treating symptoms. Sometimes it requires healing the soul as well. And now, Jesus said, his light growing stronger as the last traces of darkness faded, are you ready to see what real healing looks like? As the last echoes of temptation faded away, Jesus led me to what appeared to be a vast amphitheater of light. But instead of seats filled with spectators, I saw moments of time, countless decisions made by countless souls, each one rippling out to affect others in ways they never knew. Watch, he said, and suddenly I was seeing my own life played out before me. Every patient I'd saved, every life I'd touched, but also more painfully every opportunity I'd missed when I'd chosen science over compassion, logic over love. It wasn't shown with judgment, but with gentle understanding. Then the scene shifted to Timothy's future again. But this time I saw something different. It wasn't just his medical career or the lives he would save. I saw him standing in a church, sharing his testimony. I was saved by a doctor who gave her life for mine. She taught me that miracles aren't just things that can't be explained, they're acts of love that change us forever. There's something you need to understand about your choice, Jesus said softly. It's not just about trading your life for Timothy's. It's about what your sacrifice will teach others about love. The visions expanded, showing me how my choice would affect not just Timothy and his mother, but countless others. I saw my fellow doctors, nurses, and medical staff struggling to reconcile my death with their scientific training. Some would find faith. Others would question everything they believed, but all would be changed by the example of sacrificial love. But here's the hardest part, Jesus continued. You need to know what you're leaving behind. Suddenly, I saw all the patients I would have saved if I lived, all the medical breakthroughs I might have achieved. I saw a future where my research could have saved thousands. Isn't it selfish, I asked, my voice trembling, choosing to save one life when I could save many? Jesus smiled, and in that smile I saw infinite wisdom. Do you remember the story of the widow's mite? I nodded, remembering my mother's favorite Bible story about the poor widow who gave her last 2 coins as an offering. She gave everything she had, I said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. The value of a sacrifice isn't measured by its size, but by its completeness, he explained. Your choice to save Timothy isn't about numbers, it's about showing the world that love doesn't calculate cost and benefit. Love simply gives. Then he showed me one more vision, my mother in her final days. But this time, I saw what I hadn't seen then, how her faith in the face of suffering had affected her nurses, her doctors, even the cleaning staff who came to her room. Her choice to face death with grace had changed them all. Your mother understood, Jesus said gently. Sometimes the greatest impact we have isn't through what we achieve, but through how we love. I thought of all my years of medical training, how we were taught to make decisions based on data and probability. Everything I've learned tells me to choose the option that saves the most lives. And everything I teach tells you to love one another, as I have loved you, he replied. Remember, I didn't come to save humanity as a concept, I came to save individual souls, one heart at a time. The truth hit me with the force of revelation. My scientific mind had always sought the most efficient solution, the greatest good for the greatest number. But love didn't work that way. Love looked at one person, one moment, one choice, and gave everything. I understand now, I said, looking at the scenes of all possible futures playing out before us. It's not about choosing between saving one life or many. It's about showing that every single life has infinite worth. Jesus nodded, and in his eyes I saw both approval and challenge. But knowing this truth and living it are different things. Are you ready to not just understand sacrifice, but to become it? As I looked at all I would be giving up, my career, my future achievements, all the lives I might have saved, I felt the full weight of the choice before me. But I also felt something else, a peace that transcended all understanding. Yes, I said, and in that single word I felt the last barriers between my scientific mind and my believing heart dissolve. I'm ready. As I made my final decision, I felt a profound internal struggle begin, not between good and evil, but between the two worlds that had defined my existence, faith and science. The doctor in me railed against what I was choosing, firing off logical arguments like well-aimed syringes. Think about this rationally, my scientific mind argued. We can measure the impact of your medical career in saved lives, published research, and trained students. One life against thousands, the numbers don't add up. The thoughts came in my own voice, in the clinical tone I used when presenting cases at morning rounds. But then another voice spoke, one that sounded remarkably like my mother's. Some things can't be measured with numbers, Emma. Love doesn't follow the laws of physics. Looking at Jesus, I saw him watching this internal battle with deep understanding. Your mind and heart are not enemies, he said, gesturing to the scene still playing out around us. Watch. The vision shifted to show a series of moments from my career, but this time I saw them differently. Every time I'd made a seemingly logical medical decision, there had been something more: intuition, compassion, a deeper wisdom that transcended pure science. I saw myself in the ER, choosing to spend extra time with a dying patient's family when efficiency metrics said I should move on. I saw moments when I'd gone against standard protocols because something, call it instinct, or the Holy Spirit, told me there was more to the case than the charts showed. You've always used both, Jesus explained. Every time you chose compassion over convenience, every time you trusted your heart alongside your training, you were bringing faith and science together. The scene shifted to a future moment: Timothy performing his first surgery. I saw him pause before making the first incision, closing his eyes in brief prayer before picking up the scalpel. He'll combine both worlds, Jesus said. Your sacrifice will teach him that there's no conflict between believing in medicine and believing in miracles. As if to emphasize this point, the vision expanded to show a conference room where Timothy, now a distinguished physician, was addressing a group of medical students. Science tells us how the body works, he was saying, but it can't tell us why a doctor chooses to risk everything for a patient. That comes from something deeper. Call it love, call it faith, call it what you will. But don't ever make the mistake of thinking you have to choose between being a good scientist and having a heart that believes in something more. The battle in my mind began to quiet as understanding dawned. Every scientific breakthrough, every medical miracle, every advancement in human knowledge had come because someone dared to believe in possibilities beyond what was currently proven. Faith wasn't the enemy of science, it was its foundation. Your mother understood this, Jesus said softly. When the doctors told her the cancer was terminal, she didn't reject their diagnosis. She accepted the science while still believing in something greater. I remembered those final days, how Mom had followed every medical instruction while maintaining an unshakable peace that transcended her circumstances. She hadn't seen faith and science as opponents in a battle, but as two different languages describing the same truth. The greatest scientists in history, Jesus continued, were often people of deep faith. They studied the natural world not to disprove the divine, but to understand it better. Your sacrifice won't be a victory of faith over science, it will be a testament to how they work together. Looking at the scene of my crashed car below, where paramedics were still working frantically, I understood finally that this wasn't about choosing between being a doctor and being a believer. It was about recognizing that the deepest healing comes when we embrace both. I'm ready, I said again, but this time with new understanding. Not because faith has won over science, but because I finally see that the greatest medical truth is this: healing isn't just about fixing bodies. It's about touching souls. Jesus smiled, and in his smile I saw the harmony of all truth, scientific and spiritual, physical and metaphysical. Now, he said, you're ready to see what real healing looks like. The scene around us shifted once more, and suddenly I was back in the oncology ward, watching my mother's last days play out again. But this time, I wasn't seeing it through the frustrated eyes of a doctor who couldn't save her. I was seeing it with new understanding. From this perspective beyond time and space. Watch carefully, Jesus said softly. There's something you missed the first time. Mom lay in her hospital bed, thin and pale from months of chemotherapy. Yet her face held a serene smile that had always puzzled me. I saw myself, exhausted and desperate, poring over her charts, searching for any treatment option we hadn't tried. Look closer, Jesus guided. Not at the medical equipment or the charts. Look at her eyes. I did, and what I saw took my breath away. Even in her worst moments of pain, there was a light in her eyes that transcended her suffering. She wasn't just enduring, she was witnessing. Every nurse who came into her room left changed. Every doctor who checked her vitals found themselves lingering, drawn to something they couldn't explain. Your mother wasn't just dying, Jesus explained. She was teaching. The scene continued, and I watched as she spoke to a young nurse who was struggling with doubt. Sometimes, Mom had said, holding the nurse's hand, God's greatest miracles aren't the ones that heal our bodies, but the ones that heal our hearts. I saw moments I'd missed before, how she'd pray with the cleaning staff when they came to her room, how she'd ask about their families and offer words of wisdom and comfort. Even as her body failed, her spirit touched everyone around her. But I was so angry, I whispered, watching my past self snap at a resident who suggested hospice care. I thought she was giving up by accepting death. She wasn't giving up, Jesus corrected gently. She was showing everyone, especially you, how to face death with grace. Every moment of acceptance was an act of faith that influenced more lives than you knew. The scene shifted to her final night. I saw myself slumped in the chair beside her bed, finally asleep after days of refusing to rest. Mom was awake, her breathing labored but her eyes clear as she looked at me with such love it made my current self ache. Lord, she prayed softly, my daughter thinks she needs to save everyone. Show her that sometimes the greatest healing comes through letting go. Use my death, if you will, to teach her that life is more than what we can measure and control. I gasped, understanding flooding through me. She knew. Somehow, she knew this moment would come. Jesus nodded. Your mother's faith wasn't blind, Emma. It was built on a lifetime of seeing God work through both miracles and trials. She understood that sometimes the greatest testament to faith is how we face our darkest moments. I watched the moment of her death again, how her last breath had been peaceful, how she'd squeezed my hand one final time, how the room had seemed to fill with a presence I couldn't explain at the time but now recognized. She wasn't alone, I realized, tears flowing freely. "No one ever is," Jesus replied. "Just as you won't be alone in your sacrifice. Your mother's death taught you about faith through suffering. Now your death will teach others about faith through love." The scene faded, but the understanding remained. Mom's death hadn't been a failure of medicine or faith. It had been a testimony to how they could work together. She had used her final days to heal souls while we tried to heal her body. "Now you understand," Jesus said, "why your mother could face death with such peace. She knew it wasn't an ending, but a transformation, just as your sacrifice won't be an ending, but a beginning for so many others." I nodded, feeling closer to my mother than I had since her death. She was right all along. Some kinds of healing can't be measured in vital signs or lab results. The scene transformed again, and suddenly I was surrounded by faces I'd never forgotten, patients I'd lost over the years. Each one had left a mark on my soul. Each death had added another layer of armor around my heart. But now, seeing them in this realm between realms, I realized they weren't here to haunt me. "These are the ones you've carried," Jesus said softly. "The ones whose deaths made you doubt both science and faith." Sarah Jenkins, age 7, my first pediatric death. I watched our final moments together, how I'd performed CPR until my arms gave out, how I'd raged against the unfairness of it all. But now I saw what I couldn't see then, her spirit, peaceful and whole, rising from her broken body. She smiled at me now, no longer the sick child I'd failed to save, but a radiant being full of joy. "You didn't fail them," Jesus said, reading my thoughts. "Each death served a purpose you couldn't understand at the time." Marcus Rodriguez, the young father I'd lost on Christmas Eve. I'd spent years second-guessing my decisions that night. Now I saw how his death had brought his feuding family together, how their shared grief had healed decades of wounds. His widow had become a grief counselor, helping hundreds of others through their darkest hours. One by one, they appeared, every patient whose death I'd carried as a personal failure. But they weren't showing me their last moments of life. Instead, they showed me what had happened after the lives changed, the lessons learned, the love that had grown from loss. "But I was supposed to save them," I whispered, my doctor's training still wrestling with these revelations. "You were supposed to care for them," Jesus corrected gently. "Sometimes that means saving their lives. Sometimes it means helping them transition to what comes next. But always, it means showing them love." Linda Chen, the medical student who died of leukemia. I'd been her doctor and mentor. Her death had nearly made me quit medicine. But now I saw how her courage in facing death had inspired her classmates. 5 of them had become oncologists because of her, and through them, countless lives had been saved. "Every death ripples out into the world," Jesus explained. "Just as every act of love creates waves we can't always see." The faces continued to appear, each one a lesson I hadn't understood at the time. Some had died despite my best efforts. Others had slipped away peacefully. But all of them had changed me, shaped me, prepared me for this moment of sacrifice. "They're not here to accuse you," Jesus said as I faced each one. "They're here to thank you for being present in their final moments, for fighting for them, for caring enough to carry them with you all these years." The last face was the one that had haunted me most, Peter Walsh, age 12, who died on my operating table last year. His case had been nearly identical to Timothy's. I'd blamed myself for months, wondering if I could have done something different. But now Peter stepped forward, whole and healthy, his smile bright. "You did everything you could, Dr. Wilson," he said. "And what you learned from trying to save me helped you save Timothy. Nothing was wasted." Understanding washed over me like a healing balm. Every loss had taught me something. Every death had prepared me for what came next. They hadn't been failures, they'd been preparation for this moment, this choice. "Now you see," Jesus said, as the faces began to fade. Death isn't the enemy you fought against all these years. It's a transition, a doorway. And sometimes through sacrifice, it becomes the greatest expression of love. I looked at all these souls one last time, not as patients I'd failed, but as teachers who'd helped prepare me for my own journey. "Thank you," I whispered, and felt their love and gratitude surround me like a warm embrace. After my reconciliation with the souls of my past patients, Jesus led me to what appeared to be a vast cosmic observatory. But instead of stars and planets, I saw the interconnected web of all human lives, past, present, and future, glowing like constellations of infinite possibility. "This is what your mother meant," Jesus said. "When she told you that God writes straight with crooked lines," he gestured, and I saw my own life thread, glowing bright and intersecting with countless others. Every patient I'd treated, every life I'd touched, created patterns of light that rippled outward in endless waves. "Watch what happens," he said, touching the point where my thread intersected with Timothy's. The entire pattern shifted, creating new configurations of light and possibility. I saw how my sacrifice would affect not just Timothy's life, but the lives of everyone he would touch, his future patients, their families, the medical students he would teach. "But it's more than just the obvious connections," Jesus explained. He showed me how my death would affect my colleagues at the hospital. Dr. Stevens, the hardened atheist, would begin to question his certainty about the universe. Nurse Sarah would start a support group for healthcare workers struggling with faith and science. The ripples spread outward, touching lives I would never have imagined. "Your mother's death was part of this pattern too," he continued, showing me how her graceful acceptance of death had prepared me for this moment. "Every trial you faced, every patient you lost, every moment of doubt and questioning, all of it was preparing you for this choice." I watched in awe as the pattern expanded, showing me how seemingly random events had been subtly guided. The timing of my shift that saved Timothy, the deer on the road, even my decision to finally keep my promise to attend church, all had been threads in a tapestry I was only now beginning to comprehend. "But what about free will?" I asked, my scientific mind still grappling with the implications. "If everything is predetermined?" Jesus smiled. "The pattern exists because of free will, not in spite of it. Every choice creates new possibilities, new patterns. I don't force the design, I work with the choices my children make, weaving them into something beautiful." He showed me more how my sacrifice would inspire others to acts of love and courage, how Timothy's life would become a testament to the harmony between faith and science, how even those who doubted would be touched by the story of a doctor who gave her life for her patient. "This is why your mother could face death with such peace," Jesus explained. She saw a glimpse of this bigger picture. She understood that her death wasn't just an ending, but part of a greater plan of healing and redemption. The pattern shifted again, and I saw my own death from this new perspective. It wasn't just to trade my life for Timothy's. It was a catalyst, a divine multiplication where one act of love would spawn thousands more, creating a legacy that would ripple through generations. "Remember," Jesus said gently, "when I chose to die on the cross, it wasn't just about the act itself. It was about showing humanity the transformative power of sacrificial love. Your choice echoes that truth in a way your scientific mind can finally understand." Looking at the vast pattern of interconnected lives, I finally understood what Mom had tried to tell me, that faith wasn't about ignoring reality, but about seeing a deeper reality beneath the surface. Every scientific principle I'd learned, every life I'd saved or lost, every moment of doubt and discovery, all had been leading me to this moment of understanding. From the cosmic observatory, Jesus led me to what I can only describe as the heart of reality itself, a place where love wasn't just an emotion or a choice, but the fundamental force holding everything together. Here, I could feel every act of love ever performed, from the smallest kindness to the greatest sacrifice, each one pulsing with eternal significance. "This is what powers the universe," Jesus explained, gesturing to the radiant energy surrounding us. "Not just gravity or nuclear forces, But love in its purest form, he reached out and drew forth a strand of light. Watch this moment. I saw a mother in a war-torn country sharing her last piece of bread with her children. Then, a firefighter running into a burning building to save a stranger. A teacher spending her own money to buy supplies for struggling students. Each act of unconditional love sent ripples through the fabric of reality itself. But now, he said, watch what happens with sacrificial love. The scene shifted to show various moments throughout history, people who had given their lives for others. With each sacrifice, the ripples weren't just ripples anymore, they were waves that transformed everything they touched. This is why your choice matters so much, Jesus continued. Unconditional love breaks down barriers that nothing else can touch. It transforms not just the recipient, but everyone who witnesses it. He showed me how my sacrifice would affect Timothy's mother, Rachel. Her experience of receiving such love would change how she loved others, creating a cascade of transformation. I saw my fellow doctors and nurses wrestling with the implications of my choice. Some would find their entire worldview challenged. Others would discover a new depth in their capacity to care for patients. The barriers they'd built to protect themselves from the pain of loss would be transformed into bridges of deeper compassion. Your scientific mind always looked for measurable outcomes, Jesus said gently. But the most powerful changes often can't be measured, they can only be felt and lived. He showed me how one person transformed by love would go on to transform others, creating an endless chain of healing and hope. Then he showed me something that broke my heart open. My mother, in her final days, loving me even through her pain. I saw how her unconditional love had planted seeds that were only now beginning to bloom. Her acceptance of death, her unwavering faith, her constant love, all had been preparing me for this moment. Love is the only force that grows stronger when it's given away, Jesus explained. Your sacrifice isn't just about saving Timothy's life. It's about showing the world that love is stronger than death, that giving is greater than keeping, that losing your life can be the ultimate expression of finding it. The scene expanded to show all the lives that would be touched by this one act of sacrificial love, patients who would be healed by Timothy, families who would be comforted, students who would learn a deeper meaning of medicine. But more than that, I saw how this love would break down walls between faith and science, between doubt and belief, between fear and hope. This is my Father's greatest gift to humanity, Jesus said. Not just the capacity to love, but the ability to love unconditionally, sacrificially, transformatively. Every time someone chooses this kind of love, they participate in the very nature of God. As I absorbed these truths, I felt my scientific mind and my awakening faith finally merge into a deeper understanding. Love wasn't just an emotion to be studied by psychologists or a concept to be debated by philosophers. It was the fundamental reality underlying everything else, the force that moved atoms, healed bodies, transformed souls, and connected all of creation. The transition back to the earthly realm was gentler than I expected. Like a symphony drawing to its close, the celestial visions faded into a soft diminuendo of light. Jesus stood with me one final time, overlooking the scene of my accident and Timothy's hospital room simultaneously. "It's time," he said, his voice filled with both love and solemnity. "Are you ready to complete your journey?" I nodded, feeling a peace that transcended all understanding. Below us, I could see the paramedics still working on my body, their movements becoming slower as hope faded. In the hospital, Timothy's vital signs were strengthening, his body accepting the gift I was about to give fully. "Will I be able to say goodbye?" I asked, thinking of all those I would leave behind. Jesus smiled. "Watch," he said, and suddenly I was in my body again, but only for a moment of perfect clarity granted as a final gift. My eyes opened, surprising the paramedics who had been about to call my time of death. Sarah, my head nurse, was there. She must have heard about the accident. "Tell Timothy," I whispered, my voice barely audible but clear, "that sometimes the greatest healing comes through love." I saw the understanding dawn in Sarah's eyes. She knew about Timothy, knew what this meant. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she squeezed my hand. "We'll tell him," she promised. "We'll make sure he knows." Then I felt the gentle pull upward again, but this time it was different. Instead of watching from above, I was being woven into the fabric of love itself. I could feel my consciousness expanding, becoming part of the greater pattern I had been shown. From this new perspective, I watched as the news reached the hospital. I saw Rachel Parker, Timothy's mother, fall to her knees in gratitude and grief when she learned what had happened. I saw my colleagues struggle to process the miracle they were witnessing, Timothy's inexplicable recovery coinciding perfectly with my passing. But most beautifully, I saw Timothy open his eyes. He was confused at first, adjusting to consciousness after his long ordeal. But then something remarkable happened. He turned his head toward the window, toward the exact spot where my spirit lingered, and smiled. "Thank you, Dr. Wilson," he whispered, though he couldn't possibly know yet what had happened. But children, I realized, often see truths that adults have forgotten how to perceive. I watched as Sarah entered his room, tears still fresh on her face. She sat beside his bed and took his hand, just as she had held mine in my final moments. "Timothy," she said gently, "I have something to tell you about Dr. Wilson. She wanted you to know something very important." As she shared my final message, I felt Jesus' presence beside me once again. "Your story is just beginning," he said. "Watch how love multiplies." I saw the next few days unfold my funeral, where Timothy insisted on attending despite still being weak. I saw him place a single white rose on my coffin and make a silent promise to live a life worthy of my sacrifice. I saw Rachel hold him close, both of them crying tears that held both gratitude and grief. Most surprisingly, I saw my story begin to spread through the hospital and beyond, not as a tragedy, but as a testimony to something greater than either science or faith alone could explain. I saw how it began to break down walls between believers and skeptics, between those who trusted in medicine and those who believed in miracles. "You see," Jesus said softly, "sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the ones that defy the laws of nature, but the ones that reveal the deeper laws of love." The years unfolded before me like pages in a beautiful book, each chapter revealing how my sacrifice continued to bear fruit in ways I could never have imagined. Timothy's recovery wasn't just physical, it was a transformation that would reshape the relationship between faith and medicine for generations to come. I watched him grow from that brave 8-year-old into a brilliant young man. Through high school, he excelled in both science and theology, writing essays that bridged the gap between empirical research and spiritual truth. His valedictorian speech touched hearts when he said, "I stand here because a doctor taught me that science and faith are two wings of the same bird, both needed for flight." Medical school was his natural path, but he approached it differently than I had. Where I had once seen only cells and systems, he saw the divine design in every anatomical detail. His professors were struck by his unique ability to comfort patients not just with medical knowledge, but with a deep understanding of spiritual healing. The most beautiful transformation happened in the hospital where I had once worked. Timothy chose to do his residency there, and my old colleagues watched in amazement as he brought a new dimension to patient care. He created a program that combined cutting-edge medical treatment with spiritual support, proving that both had their place in the healing process. Rachel, his mother, became an advocate for this integrated approach to healthcare. She shared our story at medical conferences, speaking to rooms full of skeptical doctors about how a scientist's ultimate act of faith had saved her son. Gradually, the wall between medicine and spirituality began to crumble. I saw Timothy perform his first solo surgery, pausing before the first incision to whisper the prayer I had never allowed myself to speak. "Guide my hands, Lord, and help me be a vessel of your healing." The operation was successful, and more importantly, it set a precedent. Young doctors began to see that acknowledging a higher power didn't diminish their scientific expertise, it enhanced it. The support group Sarah started for healthcare workers blossomed into a nationwide movement. They called it Wilson's Circle. and it became a place where medical professionals could openly discuss the intersection of science and faith, sharing stories of unexplainable healings alongside breakthrough treatments. Most remarkably, I watched as Timothy established the Emma Wilson Center for Integrative Medicine, a place where research into miraculous healings was conducted with the same rigor as clinical trials. "We're not trying to prove miracles," he would explain to skeptics. "We're documenting how faith and science can work together to promote healing." The center became famous for its groundbreaking studies on the power of prayer and recovery rates, the impact of spiritual well-being on immune function, and the role of compassion in medical outcomes. But more than the research, it became a symbol of hope, a place where patients could receive both the best medical care and the spiritual support they needed. On the 10th anniversary of my passing, Timothy gave a speech that brought tears to even the most hardened skeptics. "Dr. Wilson saved my life twice," he said, "once through her medical skill and once through her sacrifice. She taught me that the greatest healing happens when we stop trying to separate science from faith and instead let them work together as God intended." From my place in eternity, I saw how my choice had created a legacy far beyond anything I could have accomplished in a full lifetime of medical practice. It hadn't just saved one life, it had transformed the very way medicine was practiced and understood. My mother's words proved prophetic. Sometimes God writes straight with crooked lines. My death had become a seed that grew into a garden of healing, where faith and science flourished together, where medical students learned to treat both body and soul, and where patients found hope in both the latest treatments and the timeless power of love. Jesus was right. My story wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a new chapter in the eternal narrative of how love transforms everything it touches. And through Timothy, through the countless lives he would touch, and through the revolution in medical care he would inspire, that love would continue to heal and transform for generations to come. If this story of faith, sacrifice, and the beautiful intersection of science and spirituality has touched your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences and reflections can inspire others on their own journey of discovery. Support our mission to share these powerful testimonies by subscribing to our channel, giving this video a thumbs up, and sharing it with loved ones who might find comfort and inspiration in Dr. Emma Wilson's extraordinary journey. Together, we can spread the message that miracles still happen and that love remains the greatest healing force in the universe.